Assalamu alaikum. Today we'll start with the final chapter, last and final chapter for the semester, Feminist Criticism. So, I believe we are all aware, or as aware as is possible, of the idea of feminism as projected by the media and, of course, your educators to a large extent, and the books probably that is most often prescribed for you. As women, we uh, tend to incline towards these kind of the kind of writings that have feminist overtones to it, right? So in this chapter, we will look into some of the key ideas related to the word feminism itself and how this feminist movement per se started, had its origin, moved on, and of its various forms, and how they seem to be applicable to the literary study. Okay, that's to the study of literature. That is like a feminist criticism, to put it in simple words. Okay, so we'll look into feminism and feminist criticism. Feminist criticism and the role of theory, feminist criticism and language, feminist criticism and psychoanalysis, and woman's role where Wuthering Heights is concerned, as a practical example suggested by Peter Barry. Now, this at the outset, let me tell you, this is not a PowerPoint I made myself, but it seemed good enough to serve our purpose. It's presented by Jenny Lee of College of Foreign Languages. Pretty impressive PPT. Okay, so to begin with, the idea of feminism may have had its origin, or probably not origin, a sort of revivification in the women's movement of 1960s. Okay, so the decade of 1960s is considered to be the decade that gave fresh breath, fresh life to women's movement. All right, but then it actually had its origin long back, way back, before Afraben, or you could say from the times of Queen Elizabeth I. You could say that women have been fighting for their rights, putting their foot down to get their rights, to enjoy their rights. So, practically speaking, it was in around the 18th century that Mary Wollstonecraft and her contemporaries started writing about feminism, started voicing out their displeasure in being treated as an object of mere beauty and sexuality, right? So, sorry. So, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women and Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own could be considered as the foundation on which later feminist writings were built upon. Okay, so it was a direct product of the women's movement of the 1960s, this feminism and feminist criticism per se, and the movement realized the significance of the images of women promulgated by literature. So it is not an offshoot. That is like this movement, the movement of the feminist criticism, not exactly feminism as such. It actually, showed the importance, or sort of realized the importance of the way women are projected in literature and media, of course. So it is not an offshoot or a spin-off from feminism, but one of its most practical ways of influencing everyday conduct and attitudes. And why is it a practical way? Because it is the most commonly observed and easily accepted form of excuse me, a form of what was I talking about? Form of representations. Yeah, representations is what I was looking for. Okay, so it is the way we see women projected in probably a serial, or probably there is serial is in some, or even commercials, or movies or books. It is the way a woman is projected as being submissive at all costs. I mean, being submissive in and on itself of itself is not a bad thing, but being expected, she is being expected to be submissive at all costs, against all injustices, right? So this is something that should be unacceptable, and this is where the idea of the practical, practical method of protesting against such depictions came into being. Okay, so the representations of women in literature uh, is integral to the understanding of how women can fight against such depictions and such expectations from her, right? So Torrent Moy explains, gives a very beautiful explanation of the basic differences between the terminologies of the various terminologies related to feminism: female, feminine, feminist. Female, feminine, feminist, feminist, female, feminine. Now, feminist would be a political position, as in you take a stand to speak for the female, right? That is feminist. You make a stand, you stand up for a belief. That is a political position. Feminist, the idea of feminist. Now, female is a matter of biology, as in your sexuality, as in your, it's you're biologically built to be of a gender. Okay, it is gender based. Now, feminine is a set of culturally defined characters. Now, this is where the problem occurs actually. So, these two, the idea of female and feminine, this is where all the trouble comes in. Okay, so in the 19th century fiction, you see the focus of interest is on the heroine's choice of marriage partner, which will decide her ultimate social position. So it's not merely 19th century fiction, or even before that. What you find is that a woman is treated as merely as a property, okay, property of man. So, no matter what kind of abuse she is subjected to at the hands of the man who owns her, there is a matter of ownership here, a proprietorship here. She is supposed to keep quiet, and the best way for her to survive, the only way for her to survive, is to make a good marriage. So, unless she finds a good husband as in like a rich husband, there is no hope, no scope for a woman. So that's the idea projected by the fiction of the 19th century, all right, or even before that. So in the 1970s, these mechanisms of patriarchy are exposed. So the cultural mindset in men and women which perpetuated sexual inequality, male writers constructed typical images of women. Typical images of women, not merely women, but submissive women, a servile woman, a weak woman, a woman with no brains, who has dungs for brains. Okay, so this projection of the image of a weak-boned, weak-spined woman is what what the writers, the feminist writers of that time, started, commenting upon in their works. Okay, so now see here, I have to mention that there were writers who spoke against such such inequality, such injustices against women, and believe it or not, John Stuart Mill, and there were other writers as well who wrote vehemently against such such projection of women in such manner. Okay, so yeah, here there is mention of Elaine Showalter's androtext, gynotext, how she, there is a reflection of male text and female text. Okay, so gynotext would be, where the text is written, where the work is written by women, for women, of women. Now again, there is a distinction which I don't know whether it's mentioned. Yeah, there is a distinction between the writing of women. There is gynotext. Gynotext would imply female text. Androtext would imply male text. Now there is an idea of gynotext, text written by women, sometimes written by men for women, or simply about women. Okay, so gynotext has many nuances to it. Now in the 1980s, what you find is, so this is from a sort of a decade-wise division given here. So in the 1980s, we see feminist criticism become more eclectic. Okay, so before that, it is merely the observations made by the feminist writers of the time, arguing against or protesting against the depiction of women, the image of weak women in literature, how she has to sacrifice everything for everyone, and only then she can fulfill the idea created, universally created, of a good woman. Okay, if she thinks for herself at any point of time, she is considered willful and selfish. So obviously this lays too much of a pressure on any woman for that matter. Again, later on, gradually the idea moved from androtext to, that is, the focus moved from androtext to gynotext. Again, in gynotext you have various various categories where there are texts that focus merely upon women, not from the patriarchal perspective, as was the case in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the perspective changed. Instead of looking at male texts written about women, we find that the focus is on the female text, women text written by women, for women, of women. Okay, and later in the 1980s, it goes a little more eclectic, as in it draws upon other criticism, not merely other criticism, but other kinds of writings as well, other kinds of other ideas as well, that are become necessarily incorporated with feminist criticism. Okay, so attacking male versions of the world ceases to be of any significance. We don't really care about what man thinks anymore, because now we are exploring the nature of the female world and outlook. We are more focused upon ourselves, within ourselves. Because initially the idea is to fight against the enemy. The enemy is the man there, because he is the one subjecting the woman to this to this state of servitude. Right now, the fight has been done. It has been fought and won, or probably not won. It's an ongoing debate forever. So, and see, of course, not all men are like that. We have to remember that as well. Men and women cannot be equal, because they are two very different species of being. Okay, of course, we both belong to Homo sapiens, but then we are very different, too different to be ever considered equals. Okay, so neither is the man superior to woman, nor the woman superior to man in any way. Okay, so well, so don't throw stones at me, those who are stark feminists, but still. So this movement away from the concern that men project women in a certain manner to women's writing, is to looking into the women's world, and then exploring the world within ourselves. There is this constant movement, a constant change, gradual change in the outlook of feminist criticism. So Elaine Showalter's history focused upon the history of women's writing. Okay, so in her writing, in her observation, according to her observation, we find three phases. The feminine phase that went from 1840s to 1880, which imitated male writing. It's, the andro texts, the male patriarchy. They tried to fashion their writing upon what they have read from the male writers. So whether you take George Eliot or Jane Austen or Bronte sisters, there is a sort of a similarity, not similarity, they try to replicate the style of men to some extent. Not, I mean, there are female, there is a female tone to it because it is inevitable. Okay, it's not consciously done, it is inevitable. But they designed their writings on, works of their, of their male counterparts. Okay, so there is, this phase is of the imitation. So it's not merely in literary field but in critical field as well. Okay, so whatever criticism they wrote in the feminine phase, it is sort of a replica of what men wrote. Now feminist phase is where there is a sort of if that goes from 1880 to 1920, a sort of uniformity is maintained where they create their own place, where they are strong enough in their own selves, in their own talents, in their own style, and they maintain a tradition of their own. Now female phase is where, that is after 1920s, they looked at particularly at female writing and female experience. So the first phase, the feminine phase, would be where they try to imitate dominant male artistic norms and aesthetic standards. And the second phase, the feminist phase, would be where they which turned quite radical and took separatist positions, moving away, and maintained a certain severe position against such male imitations of male writing. And female phase, the final phase, that has been maintained since 1920s, looks particularly at female writing and female experience. Now these are the observations made by Elaine Showalter. Okay. Now there are three main particular areas discussed in Parry's book. Okay. One is the role of theory, and the other would be the the nature of language, and the third would be the value or otherwise of psychoanalysis. Okay, so role of theory, role of language, that is the nature of language that is used in feminist writing, feminist criticism, and what kind of value is accorded to psychoanalysis. Why psychoanalysis is necessary is because it is more psychological than most. The approach of feminist criticism itself is extremely psychological in nature, because it takes you away from age-old repression of the gender bias. Okay, the gender bias that we are subjected to, that we've been conditioned to believe from ancient times. Now these repressed ideas have found an outlet in these writings. So there is a definite role for psychoanalysis. Okay, so we'll first look at the role of theory. Now speaking of theory, we are not particularly sticking to feminist criticism alone, or the theory of feminist criticism alone. As I said earlier, it had become more eclectic, drawing upon different streams and categories of theories. Okay, so different subjects were taken into account, but not all feminist writers were open to it, especially Anglo-American writers. They were rather restricted in their approach, so their major interest remained in the traditional critical concepts like theme, motive, and characterization. So, the Anglo-American version of feminism is skeptical about recent critical theory and more cautious in using it. So, close reading and explication of individual literary text. Here, close reading would imply that they stick to the book alone, the work, which is a subject of study for you, and the explication of individual literary text. So, they do not diverge out to other streams, to different streams. Okay, now when we speak of Anglo American, not all of them are English, or not all of them are American. It's a mixture of both. Okay, now comparatively speaking, the French feminists, okay, I'm leaving out English feminists here, the French feminists were more inclusive, okay, because they had adopted and adapted a great deal of post-structuralist and psychoanalytic criticism. Okay, so French feminists, they were open to structuralism, post-structuralism, and psychoanalytic criticism. Not even structuralism, because post-structuralism is what gives way to creating dissent as in breaking down barriers, breaking down the set rules, okay, so as to reconfigure, restructure ideas and values and opinions that have been treated as God-given truth. Right? God-given truth means, things that have been taken for granted for centuries. Post-structuralism gives you an outlet for you to break them and see them in through different lenses, through different perspectives. So French feminists had sort of diverged out a little bit, whereas Anglo-American version of feminism is more constricted and extremely traditional and unwilling to move out, except for looking at critical concepts like theme, motive, and characterization. They accept the conventions of literary realism and treat literature as a series of representations of women's lives and experience. Okay, series of representations of women's lives and experiences, in they see literature as reflecting life. Okay, and the presentation of women in literature as real, largely real. Okay, women's lives, their experiences is real, and and they see the close reading and explication of individual literary texts is the major business of literary criticism. So now this kind of criticism is quite common, has a lot of many things common with the liberal humanist approach. Okay, liberal humanists, that's what they do, right? They treat every literature, every literary work as real, but they still they do. I was talking about how they are similar to liberal humanists, right? But see, you also have to remember that there were feminists who relied largely on historical and non-literary material. Historical data, as in the some documents used of a certain period to which a text belongs, and some memoirs written by certain women who are portrayed in some way in some text. All these data are referred to by many feminist writers, Anglo-American feminist writers, okay, feminist critics for that matter. So one of chief of them would be Elaine Showalter, okay, because it is a common practice with Showalter to take up such and of course there's Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gobar and Patricia Stubbs and Rachel Brownstein. All of these writers, all of these critics are known for using historical data and non-literary material and focus upon the work in itself, okay, rather than moving out of the literary stream, or rather than looking into other streams. Okay, so even though most of these critics are are American rather than Anglo, there is a question of the English feminists, specifically English feminists, because they are known to be more socialist feminist in orientation, aligned with cultural materialism or Marxism. Okay, so it is obviously unsatisfactory to try to assimilate it to a non-theoretical category. Um, So you see, there are plenty of books. There is plenty of writing material to be found in the 1980s that focus from the English side, from the English feminist critic group, who focused upon the Marxist approach or the socialist approach of of feminist being. Okay, so they are not entirely eclectic per se, but they tend to look at the social value, the social significance of women's writing. Okay, women's writing or women's representation in literature. So chief of them would be Cora Kaplan. Cora Kaplan, who is British, actually who is American, but worked for Britain for many years. Now she is also a member of the Marxist Feminist Literature Collective, a group whose very existence indicates the strong political and theoretical interest of the of this kind of feminist criticism. Okay, so again, there are other writers, other critics, for instance, Catherine Belsey, and probably there were other writers. Of course, Toril Moy. How could we forget? Toril Moy and Julia Swindell, Terry Lovell. So all of these writers, they wrote quite vehemently against the superiority, superiority of male superiority, not only male superiority, but especially the subjectivity of the female's economic and social condition. So they took very strong political stand, and like focusing upon how the wealth is speaking of the property rights, of marital rights, of the right to work, and the conditions that are provided for women on what grounds to work, where to work, how to work, and the right to vote. All of these were, like, of course, right, the suffragettes had been working at large since 1800s, right? Now this is sort of a place where they take a major stand against the literary representation of women from a socialist perspective, okay, from a Marxist perspective. Now French feminists, on the other hand, they not only focus upon the practicality of such protests, but also look into the various psychological factors, so as contributing to the female representation in literature. So to them, literature is never merely a representation of reality, it goes beyond it. Okay, so the main difference between the Anglo-American version of feminism and the French feminists is the belief of the former in the literary text as something that resembles or is a simulacrum of reality, whereas whereas the French feminists tend to believe literature as something beyond reality, something other than real. Okay, so I'll stop it here. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow and hopefully finish it. For now, this is all. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Jazakallahu khair.